The first time my shadow betrayed me, I thought I was losing my mind. It was late, nearly midnight, and the streets were deserted. The kind of empty that makes you hyper-aware of every noise, the soft rustle of leaves blown across the pavement, the distant hum of a street lamp. My apartment wasn't far, just 6 blocks, but each step felt heavier than usual. It had been a long day at work, the kind that saps your energy, and leaves you wondering why you even bother. I wasn't thinking about much, just putting one foot in front of the other, counting the cracks in the sidewalk. That's probably why it took me so long to notice it. At first, I thought the streetlights were acting up. Their glow seemed weaker, the shadows they cast longer and darker than they should have been. I chalked it up to fatigue, a trick of my tired eyes. But when I passed the corner of Maple and Fifth, I noticed something strange. The light overhead buzzed faintly, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The shadow of the lamppost stretched out across the road, crisp and defined despite the dim glow. My shadow joined it, elongating in the same direction. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the way it suddenly stopped moving. I froze mid-step, staring at the dark shape that should have been a perfect mirror of me. I raised my hand hesitantly, a small wave to reassure myself that everything was fine. It didn't wave back. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step forward, then another, testing it. The shadow remained frozen, stiff and upright, its edges unnaturally sharp against the pavement. I blinked, hoping that when my eyes opened, the illusion would break. But it didn't. Instead, the shadow's head, my shadow's head, tilted slowly to the side, as if acknowledging me for the first time. The air around me felt wrong. It wasn't cold or warm. It was heavy, oppressive, like stepping into a room where something terrible had happened. The buzz of the street lamp faded into the background, swallowed by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The shadow tilted its head further, almost curiously, as though it were studying me. A predator observing prey. I stumbled, tripping over the uneven curb as I scrambled to put more distance between myself and the impossible thing on the ground. My foot slipped, and I fell hard onto the sidewalk, the impact jarring enough to make me bite my tongue. The coppery taste of blood filled my mouth, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the shadow, which hadn't moved from its spot. Or at least, that's what I thought, until I saw the edges begin to ripple. It was subtle at first, like a wave spreading through ink dropped in water. Then the entire shadow shifted, stretching unnaturally long across the pavement, its edges licking toward me like black flames. I scrambled to my feet, panic tightening my chest as I bolted down the street. My footsteps echoed loudly in the stillness, but they weren't alone. Behind me, I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic sound that wasn't mine. I didn't dare look back. The shadows around me seemed alive now, flickering and twisting even where no wind stirred. They crawled along the ground, clinging to the edges of buildings and street signs, reaching for me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I turned the corner onto my street, the safety of my apartment just a block away. When I finally reached my door, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands, I made the mistake of glancing behind me. For a split second I saw it, my shadow, pooling at the base of the street lamp like a puddle of darkness, its form shifting and rippling as if laughing silently. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wood as I tried to calm my racing heart. It had to be a trick of the light. A hallucination. Exhaustion, maybe? I repeated these thoughts to myself like a mantra, trying to drown out the faint whispering that seemed to follow me even inside. That night, I slept with every light in the apartment turned on. But deep down I knew. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stay outside. For the first few days after it happened, I convinced myself it wasn't real. Exhaustion, stress, maybe even some strange optical illusion. That's all it was. My mind was tired. My eyes were playing tricks on me. People don't like to admit it, but we're good at lying to ourselves when we're scared. And I was scared. I stopped walking home at night. If I worked late, I'd order a ride or wait until the next morning to finish anything unfinished. I told myself it was because of the neighborhood, not exactly the safest place to walk alone after dark. But I knew the truth. I was avoiding shadows. My shadow. At first it helped. Bright, fluorescent lights at the office didn't cast the same crisp shapes that street lights did. My shadow stayed close, small and unremarkable, pinned beneath my chair or blending into the glare of my computer monitor. I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that my fear had made it worse than it really was. That hope didn't last long. It started small, just little things I noticed when I was at home. My shadow didn't always move with me. Sometimes, when I turned a corner, I'd catch it lagging behind, just for a fraction of a second. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe the uneven glow of my old ceiling fixture. But the more I watched, the more obvious it became. The next sign came at night. I'd always been a light sleeper, waking up at the slightest creak of the floorboards or hum of a car passing outside. That week, though, it wasn't noises that woke me. It was silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in on you, wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. The kind that makes you sit up in bed, heart racing, even though you don't know why. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the air grow heavier with each passing second. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe a dream I couldn't quite remember. But then I started hearing it. Whispers. They were faint, just at the edge of my hearing, but unmistakable. A low, murmuring sound that came from the corners of the room, where the light didn't quite reach. The words weren't clear, just a jumble of sounds layered on top of each other, like dozens of voices speaking at once. But sometimes I thought I heard my name. Elliot, it would say, so soft I could almost believe I'd imagined it. Almost. The whispers didn't stop when I turned on the lights. If anything, they grew louder, as if the shadows resented the intrusion. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, clutching a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The shadows would retreat under the bed, behind the dresser, into the folds of the curtains, but they never disappeared completely. They were always there, waiting for the light to fade. By the third night, I was running on fumes. Sleep was impossible, and I could barely focus at work. My coworkers noticed, of course. They asked if I was feeling okay, if something was wrong. I brushed it off with excuses: bad sleep, too much coffee, a tough project. It was easier than telling them the truth, that I was being haunted by my own shadow. It got worse when I tried to ignore it. Shadows have a way of creeping into everything, no matter how hard you try to avoid them. They're in every room, every corner, every little place where the light doesn't quite reach. I started noticing them in places I shouldn't have. In the reflection of my computer screen, twisting behind me like smoke. In the rearview mirror of my car, pooling in the back seat. One night, I heard a scraping sound coming from the living room. It was slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across the hardwood floor. I froze in bed, clutching the blanket to my chest, listening as the sound grew closer. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whatever it was could hear it. I forced myself to move, grabbing the flashlight from my nightstand. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the hallway. There was nothing there. No footsteps, no marks on the floor, no signs of anyone or anything. But when I turned back toward the bedroom, the light caught something. A shadow, not mine, stretched along the wall. It flickered slightly, as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. And then it moved, sliding across the wall faster than I could follow, vanishing into the corner of the room. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. Every time I closed my eyes I could feel it. Watching me. Waiting for the light to fail. By the sixth night, I was unraveling. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, clawing at the edges of my sanity. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, phrases spoken in a language I didn't understand, low and guttural but with an unmistakable rhythm. It was as if the shadows were holding a conversation, and I was the subject. I hadn't slept in over 48 hours. Every time I tried, my body tensed with the certainty that something was watching me. Even in the light, I felt its presence. I could see my shadow flickering under the desk, stretching across the wall when it shouldn't have. It didn't stay where it belonged anymore. That night, the air in my apartment felt different, thicker, heavier. I kept all the lights on, even the harsh fluorescent one in the kitchen, but it didn't matter. Shadows were everywhere. They pooled under the table, crept along the edges of the bookshelves, and gathered in the corners like dark stains on reality. I sat on my bed, flashlight clutched tightly in one hand, my phone in the other. I'd considered calling someone, anyone, but what would I even say? My shadow's alive, and I think it's trying to kill me. They'd lock me up before I finished the sentence. So I sat there, staring at the faint line of light under my bedroom door, waiting for something I couldn't name. Around midnight, the bulb in my bedside lamp began to flicker. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. The flickering grew worse, the light stuttering faster and faster until it finally went out, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch until the beam cut through the black. The shadows retreated slightly, their edges curling as if burned. But they didn't disappear. That's when I saw it. At the foot of my bed, my shadow stood upright, detached from the wall. It was tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the ceiling. Its edges were jagged and sharp, like the broken outline of a figure sketched in charcoal. It tilted its head, just as it had on the street, but this time, it didn't stop there. The shadow shifted, its form rippling and stretching, as if it were trying to decide what shape to take. "You can't run anymore," it whispered. The voice didn't come from its mouth, if it even had one. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the air, pressing against my skull. My grip on the flashlight tightened, the beam shaking as I pointed it toward the thing at the foot of my bed. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, shrinking slightly under the light. Then it lunged. The darkness surged forward like a wave, swallowing the room in an instant. The flashlight fell from my hands, its beam flickering weakly before being snuffed out. I tried to scream, but the air was thick and suffocating, pressing against my chest like a weight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I felt it, cold and insidious, wrapping around my limbs, pulling me down. Not physically, I was still on my bed, but it felt as though the ground beneath me had given way, dragging me into a place I wasn't meant to go. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening roar as the world dissolved into blackness. When the sensation of falling finally stopped, I opened my eyes. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence I'd known in my apartment, the oppressive, heavy stillness. This was different. It was alive, vibrating faintly in the air, pressing against my eardrums like a subtle hum just beyond the range of hearing. I was lying on the ground, though ground wasn't the right word for it. The surface beneath me felt cold and pliable, shifting slightly under my weight, like standing on frozen smoke. It pulsed faintly, a steady rhythm, as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. I pushed myself to my feet, legs trembling as I took in my surroundings. The world around me was dark, but not pitch black. There was a faint, silvery glow in the air, just enough to illuminate the landscape. What I saw made my stomach twist. It was my world, but wrong. The buildings in the distance leaned at impossible angles, their walls warping and flickering like images on a broken TV screen. Trees grew upside down, their roots twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers. Streets and sidewalks stretched unnaturally long, spiraling into the horizon before vanishing into the void. The entire place felt unstable, as if it were caught between existing and unraveling. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and acrid. Breathing it felt wrong, like it was filling my lungs with something heavier than air. Every step I took was accompanied by a soft, wet sound, as though the ground were exhaling beneath me. Then I saw them. At first, they were just shapes in the distance, tall, thin figures standing motionless among the warped ruins. I couldn't make out any details, but the way they stood, unnaturally still and perfectly upright, made my skin crawl. They weren't just standing there, they were watching. "Welcome to Umbra." The voice came from behind me, low and guttural, each word vibrating through the air. I spun around, heart racing, and froze. It was my shadow. Or at least, something wearing its shape. It stood upright, detached from the ground, its edges flickering like a dying flame. Its form was human-like but wrong, its limbs too long, its features sharp and angular. It moved with a strange fluidity, its body rippling as though made of liquid darkness. "Where am I?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. "The place where shadows live," it said simply. Its voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "The place your world has hidden from itself for centuries." "Umbra," I whispered, tasting the unfamiliar word. My shadow nodded, its head tilting in that unsettling way I'd come to dread. "A prison. A barrier. A balance. Call it what you will, but it is all that stands between your world and oblivion." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what it was saying. "Why am I here? What do you want from me?" "You are a beacon," it said, stepping closer. Its movements were fluid and deliberate, each step causing the ground beneath it to ripple. "Your light is stronger than most. That is why they are drawn to you. Why I am drawn to you." "Who's they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It gestured toward the distant figures, its form flickering as it spoke. "The forgotten ones. The ones we have kept locked away. For centuries, shadows have been their anchors, their jailers. We maintain the balance. But the balance is breaking." As if on cue, the figures in the distance began to move. Their shapes flickered like static, warping and twisting as they glided toward us. They didn't walk, there were no footsteps, no sound, just a steady, menacing approach. My shadow stepped in front of me, its form growing darker, sharper. "They cannot be allowed to cross into your world," it said. "If they do, everything you know will end." I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The figures were closer now, their forms becoming clearer. They weren't human, not entirely. Their bodies were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their heads featureless voids. They flickered constantly, as though struggling to hold their shape, and where their edges blurred, the darkness bled into the air like smoke. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Fight," my shadow said simply. The ground beneath me began to tremble, the rhythmic pulse growing louder, faster. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against my skin. The figures were almost upon us now, their movements speeding up, their forms growing more distorted. My shadow turned to me, its flickering edges blazing with a strange intensity. "Your light is the key," it said. "But if you wish to survive, you must let me guide you." Before I could respond, the first figure lunged. The figure lunged, its form rippling like smoke caught in a violent wind. I stumbled backward, barely managing to dodge as it passed by me, leaving an icy chill in its wake. Its body was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was overwhelming. It didn't just move, it consumed the space around it, leaving the air thick and suffocating, as though its very existence was an assault on reality. "Move!" my shadow shouted, its voice cutting through the oppressive silence. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The ground beneath me trembled with every step I took, pulsing in that steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo in my chest. The figures were closing in now, more of them emerging from the darkness, their flickering shapes blending together into a mass of writhing shadows. "What do I do?" I yelled, panic choking my voice. "Light," my shadow said, stepping in front of me. Its form grew darker, sharper, the edges of its body flaring like black flames. "Your light is their weakness. But you must focus it. Control it." I didn't understand. "My light? What light?" My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words, but there was no time to think. The first figure turned, its head snapping toward me in a motion that was too fast, too precise. It lunged again, this time faster, its elongated limbs stretching toward me like claws. Instinctively, I raised my hands as if to shield myself. That's when I felt it, a faint warmth in my palm, small and flickering, like the spark of a dying flame. I looked down and saw it, a faint orb of light, no bigger than a candle flame, hovering just above my hand. It pulsed weakly, its glow barely illuminating the space around it. "Focus!" my shadow shouted. The figure was almost upon me now, its claw-like limbs reaching from my chest. Without thinking, I thrust my hand forward, and the orb flared to life, its light exploding outward in a sudden burst. The figure screeched, a high-pitched, guttural sound that made my ears ache, and recoiled, its form dissolving into tendrils of smoke. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the faint glow in my hand. The warmth was stronger now, the light steadier, but it still felt fragile, like it could vanish at any moment. "That is your strength," my shadow said, its voice calmer now. "Your light is the only thing that can stop them. But you must learn to wield it." "How?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Before it could answer, another figure attacked, and then another. The air was alive with movement now, the writhing mass of shadows surging toward us like a tidal wave. My shadow moved with unnatural speed, its body twisting and stretching as it fought them off, each movement precise and deliberate. I tried to mimic its actions, focusing on the light in my hand, willing it to grow stronger. With every pulse of light, the figures recoiled, their forms breaking apart like ash caught in a breeze. But for every one I destroyed, two more took its place, their movements growing faster, more frenzied. "They're endless!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "No," my shadow replied. "But they are persistent. They feed on your fear, your doubt. If you falter, they will consume you." The ground beneath me began to shift, the rhythmic pulsing growing faster, erratic. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight. I could feel the strain of it, the oppressive energy of this place sapping my strength with every passing second. "Why me?" I demanded, my voice raw with desperation. "Why am I here? What do you want from me?" "You are the beacon," it said again, its voice unyielding. "Your light is the key. Without it, the barrier will fall." The barrier. I didn't know what it meant, but I could feel its importance in the weight of my shadow's words. This place, this world, it wasn't meant to exist alongside mine. It was wrong, unnatural, a twisted reflection of reality. And if these things crossed over, I didn't want to think about what would happen. The figures were relentless, their forms blending together into a single, monstrous mass that towered over us. My shadow moved to shield me, its body flaring with dark flames as it held the creatures back. "You must act now," it said, its voice strained. "Or all will be lost." The light in my hand flickered, its glow weakening as my energy faltered. I could feel the fear creeping in, threatening to overwhelm me. My body ached, my breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of this place pressed harder with every passing moment. "You can do this," my shadow said, its voice softer now. "But you must let go of your fear. Focus on the light. Focus on your strength." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the chaos around me. The whispers, the flickering shadows, the oppressive air, I pushed it all aside, focusing only on the warmth in my hand. Slowly, the light began to grow, its glow spreading outward, pushing back the darkness. When I opened my eyes, the light exploded outward in a blinding burst, consuming everything in its path. The figures screeched in unison, their forms disintegrating into smoke and ash. The ground trembled violently, the rhythmic pulse reaching a deafening crescendo before finally going still. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the light began to fade, and I collapsed to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion. My shadow stood beside me, its form flickering weakly. "It's not over," it said, its voice barely audible. "The barrier still stands, but it won't hold forever. You must be ready when they return." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted again, and the world dissolved into darkness. The darkness that followed felt different. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating black of Umbra. It was softer, quieter, like the absence of sound after a storm. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to find myself back in that warped, impossible landscape. But instead, I was in my bed. For a moment, I thought it was over. The familiar hum of the fridge drifted in from the kitchen, and pale morning light spilled through the window, painting soft lines across the floor. Everything looked as it should, ordinary, untouched. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with relief. But then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the sunlight catching the curtains in a strange way. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the shadows weren't behaving as they should. They stretched unnaturally across the room, their edges flickering like static. My heart sank as the whispers returned, faint and distant, like echoes in a long, dark tunnel. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, planting my feet on the cold wooden floor. My shadow pulled beneath me, motionless. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move. When it finally did, my breath caught in my throat. It tilted its head, just like it had that first night on the street. "You locked them away," it whispered, its voice colder now, sharper. "But the barrier is weak. It won't hold forever." I stood slowly, my legs shaking. "What do you mean?" "I stopped them." "You delayed them," it interrupted. The shadow rose from the floor, standing upright, its form flickering with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The balance is fragile, and you are the key. As long as you live, the barrier holds. But it is incomplete. There will always be cracks." I took a step back, my hands trembling. "So, what now? What do you want from me?" It moved closer, its shape rippling as it spoke. "You must remain vigilant. Your light is the only thing keeping them at bay. But it comes with a price." "What price?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My shadow didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head again, a motion that felt almost sympathetic. "You are bound to me now," it said finally. "Your light, your shadow, they are one. If you falter, they will return. And next time, they will not stop until your world is theirs." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't over. It would never be over. I glanced toward the window, where the sunlight spilled across the floor. The shadows there seemed normal, calm. But when I looked back at my own, it was still watching me, its edges flickering faintly. "What do I do now?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow's form wavered, growing fainter as the light around it intensified. "You survive," it said simply. "And when the time comes, you fight. Here's the expanded final part, leading to the resolution and twist." The darkness that followed felt different. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating black of Umbra. It was softer, quieter, like the absence of sound after a storm. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to find myself back in that warped, impossible landscape. But instead, I was in my bed. For a moment, I thought it was over. The familiar hum of the fridge drifted in from the kitchen, and pale morning light spilled through the window, painting soft lines across the floor. Everything looked as it should, ordinary, untouched. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with relief. But then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just the sunlight catching the curtains in a strange way. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the shadows weren't behaving as they should. They stretched unnaturally across the room, their edges flickering like static. My heart sank as the whispers returned, faint and distant, like echoes in a long, dark tunnel. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, planting my feet on the cold wooden floor. My shadow pulled beneath me, motionless. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move. When it finally did, my breath caught in my throat. It tilted its head, just like it had that first night on the street. "You locked them away," it whispered, its voice colder now, sharper. "But the barrier is weak. It won't hold forever." I stood slowly, my legs shaking. "What do you mean?" "I stopped them." You delayed them," it interrupted. The shadow rose from the floor, standing upright, its form flickering with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The balance is fragile, and you are the key. As long as you live, the barrier holds. But it is incomplete. There will always be cracks." I took a step back, my hands trembling. "So, what now? What do you want from me?" It moved closer, its shape rippling as it spoke. You must remain vigilant. Your light is the only thing keeping them at bay. But it comes with a price. What price? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My shadow didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head again, a motion that felt almost sympathetic. You are bound to me now, it said finally. Your light, your shadow, they are one. If you falter, they will return. And next time, they will not stop until your world is theirs. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand answers. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't over. It would never be over. I glanced toward the window, where the sunlight spilled across the floor. The shadows there seemed normal, calm. But when I looked back at my own, it was still watching me, its edges flickering faintly. What do I do now? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow's form wavered, growing fainter as the light around it intensified. You survive, it said simply. And when the time comes, you fight. For the next few days, I tried to return to normal. I went back to work, answered emails, made small talk with coworkers. I even convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, it had all been a nightmare. That none of it was real. But the signs were always there. Shadows behaved differently around me now. They stretched too far, lingered too long, their movements just slightly out of sync with the world around them. At night, the whispers returned, faint but persistent, reminding me that I was never truly alone. The first real test came a week later. I was sitting at my desk, the afternoon sun streaming through the window behind me. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually felt comforting. But not today. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, small and darting, slipping beneath the conference room door. I froze, my pulse quickening. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the room for anything unusual. The shadows seemed normal at first, but as I stared, I noticed something. One of them wasn't attached to anything. It moved slowly, deliberately, crawling along the wall like spilled ink. My hand tightened around the flashlight I now carried everywhere, its weight a constant reminder of what I'd been through. The shadow stopped, its edges flickering, and then it turned. For a split second I saw it, a face, featureless and blank, staring back at me. I didn't hesitate. I clicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the dim light. The shadow recoiled instantly, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a gust of wind. It screeched softly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine, and then it was gone. I leaned back in my chair, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My coworkers didn't notice. They kept typing away, oblivious to the thing that had just been in the room with us. I glanced down at my own shadow, stretched across the floor beneath me. It flickered faintly, its head tilting in a motion I now recognized all too well. This is just the beginning, it whispered,